So, welcome to the final edition of the Spring ePublic of Letters. Our speaker today is Noah Cole. Noah Cole is a PhD student in history at Florida State University. He's also the web manager for the Society for Italian Historical Studies. Noah does fascinating work on political thought, particularly factions in preaching in the 15th century, especially Florence. And that is the topic he's going to be talking with us about today. So, Noah.
All right. Yes, I'm excited to be here. Thank you all for being here. And now we're going to suffer through me trying to get my screen sharing going. So let's see if I can manage that. Um, all right. Can you all see my screen? We're never leaving the days of COVID. I'm not hearing anything, but I'm going to continue. Thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to be here. Today, we're going to talk quite a lot about factionalism and particularly kind of political theory and some of my research. Now, two important caveats. I'm going to copy some other presenters who have done great work in this ePublics of Letters series and say first that this is a work in progress. That's not a plea for mercy, but just I would be very happy to get your feedback and thoughts on this project, but it's ongoing, right? And then secondly, many of you who have tried to build a summation of your research, I'm the usual caveat that I wish I could pack this more with even more nuance than it has. So I'm happy to talk about some stuff I left out at the end. But let's go ahead and dive in. I want to start with this excerpt here, right? And this is depicting sort of this kind of a recurring moment in Florentine history of sort of factional conflict. And this comes from Jean Brucker's The Society of Renaissance Florence. And I know you're capable of reading, but I'm going to read it to you, right? On Friday morning, January 17th, Messer Giorgio Scali was executed for treason on the wall of the captain's courtyard. He confessed that he was going to surrender the city to Messer Bernardo Visconti of Milan, and that on the 21st he was going to ravage the city and rob and kill all of the Guelphs. On Saturday, the 18th, the cry went up, "Long live the Parte Guelfa," and the Guelphs, all armed with swords in hand, ran through the city streets. The city was peaceful, and that night the Guelphs fortified themselves. And I think this excerpt kind of reflects how we tend to understand factionalism, right? There were these episodic moments of conflict and crisis, and factions during these moments were often the products of local power blocks that had been for some period vying for power against other factions. But when international players, right, or people outside the city, like in our case here, Bernardo Visconti of Milan, he's this individual trying to take over Florence, these local power blocks had to contend with more international players, forcing both local players and international players to sort of contend with or even adopt factional loyalties, right? And I don't want to get into the weeds about this specific vignette in particular, but I think it highlights how we tend to study factions and partisans as institutions and as products of sort of like structural politics, right? And in fact, factions in the literature have been described as alternatively interest groups, as elongated family networks, as ephemeral amalgamations of interest, as organs of government, and as corrosive entities that slowed state formation. So there's a lot at stake when we talk about this. But I think we can contrast this with what a man named Bernardino of Siena, who we'll talk about, wrote 50 years later in the mid-1430s. And Bernardino of Siena in the mid-1430s wrote a series of sermons on the issue of factionalism. And in his denunciation of partisanship, he indicated that he felt that John of Patmos, the author of the Book of Revelation, actually had much to say about partisans. And this is just a little excerpt that he wrote here, right? Quote, "The evangelist said, and I beheld and heard the voice of one eagle flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, namely to that divisive and factional one. Woe on account of the sin of the heart. Woe because of sinful speech. Woe because of the sin of the wicked acts of partisanship." Now, while it was not new by the 1400s for Italians to bemoan the issues of factionalism and political conflict, the sophistication that Bernardino brought to the issue was, to my knowledge, new. He wrote 5 sermons on the condition of partisanship and the mental state of the partisan. Bernardino's articulation of partisanship as a product of the heart, as an issue of emotion, and related to the apocalypse, stands in some contrast to scholars who tend to focus on factionalism as a product of power politics, competition for offices, honor culture, and the like. Now, I will argue today that some 15th century preachers created a remarkable discourse on the issues of factionalism, and that we should consider their writings on the issue as a sort of understudied form of medieval political theory. Specifically, my preachers will variously describe factionalism as a product of deviant emotional states, demonic possession, or as the political form of discord. Now, if you're familiar with factionalism in medieval Italy, you probably associate it with some of the greatest hits of Italian history, as you well should, right? Dante Alighieri, due to factionalism, was exiled from Florence and thereupon, being very sad, began his famous Commedia. This, of course, was after he himself participated in factionalism, culminating in him fighting in battle against the Ghibellines, right? There are the Chronicles of Villani, where Villani bemoans how his fellow Florentines seemed incapable of resisting the tides of factionalism. Likewise, the famous Medici family rose to power due to their skill in weaponizing factional ties. A little bit later, but contemporaneous with the Medici, right, Savonarola, that famous preacher, is burned in part due to controversies over obedience to the Pope. But a contributing factor was the faction that had emerged supporting him, his prophetic image, and his political reform efforts, such as the creation of the Great Council. Finally, Machiavelli and factionalism go hand in hand, right? Whether you think of him as the teacher of evil, as people in the 19th century did, or what have you, he was nourished by factionalism, right? Indeed, pick a study on medieval Italy and factionalism will probably be mentioned. Studies on peace and peacemaking obviously discuss factionalism as one of the inversions of peace, and so you have to contend with it. Similarly, the many studies on peace preaching in particular discuss factionalism. Meanwhile, studies on violence, hatred, and honor culture often discuss how notions of loyalty, patronage, and ideas about revenge fueled factional violence. Elsewhere, Melissa Vise has very recently shown how important slander was to contemporaries in the 14th century who were worried about maintaining a functioning civic community, right? She shows how slander and words, right? Words were the constitutive element of the fabric of the community. Scholars who study governance in the medieval Italian state, like Christine Shaw, John Watts, and Giorgio Chitolini, in very different works, discuss factionalism as both a divisive and constitutive element of the state. And I promise we're almost done with the lit review, but it's important to show you the stakes of this study, right? Beyond these general studies, there are, of course, scholars who have studied factionalism directly. Andrea Zorzi and Marco Gentile have decisively shown that factions provided structure to political life and followed certain logics of political conflict and stability, and they were not purely destructive institutions in regard to governance, as had been previously argued. Serena Ferrante has shown that the Guelph identity, even into the 16th century, could be called a political constellation and sort of bound groups of Florentines together around this identity. Moreover, in her work, L'Ultimi Guelfi, she chronicles the long-term purchase that being Guelph commanded over specific medieval Italians. And then finally, there are studies like those of Edward Muir, where he shows that partisan identities were often activated in times of crisis. And as he says, people often realized they were a partisan once they found themselves burning a building to the ground or clubbing an adversary to death. And his book is very, very good. And then finally, scholars like Cynthia Pulchrity and Bernadette Peton have shown how peace preachers, usually mendicants, developed increasingly sophisticated and often entertaining ways to move the laity towards peace, love, and unity, all of which were predicated on charity. As part of this, they discuss how the inversion of peace and love was war, faction, hate, and a whole host of other emotions, activities, and beliefs. Now, what all of these studies have in common is that factionalism and partisan activities are either an important or even central element of their studies. But we only hear about what factions did, how they were composed, and perhaps why they acted the way they did due to local contextual factors. We do not learn how contemporaries understood factionalism more broadly. Factionalism was everywhere. That's what these studies show. What did people think about it? And that's really the major question that my study tries to kind of tackle. And just briefly, this slide is my effort to summarize all of the different angles that I just kind of threw at you. And the first section is that, when you read about factionalism in medieval Italy, it comes up over and over and over. It is a causal factor in so many studies, but most of the time, these scholars are not out to explain factionalism to you. So they devote a few pages to it. They explain how it has something to do with state making, exile, humanism, the rise of the Medici, what have you, right? Meanwhile, I don't have time to really get into this, but I can talk about it in the Q&A. Medieval factionalism has much to do, or has a lot to say for scholars of early modernity and modernity, right? I mean, the consensus of political scientists, as far as I can tell, is nothing less that modern deliberative democracy, especially in the form of republics that have political parties, those only exist once the medieval faction dies. And so they make all these interesting arguments about how you can only have centralizing states once the medieval faction is gone. Strange things like, Martin Luther survives because of the factionalism in the Holy Roman Empire. And so, we should think about if he had emerged 50 years later, would he have not been captured by the papacy and what have you, right? And then others have argued that colonialism and imperialism was just European medieval factionalism gone abroad, right? And that the medieval faction dies because Europeans just export it out to the rest of the world. And so all of this sets us up for this wonderful foil that I'm very grateful for Matthew Cesar for saying, which he wrote the most recent State of the Field essay, in which he says, quote, "Even when the existence of factions is not in doubt, the overwhelming variety of discordant interpretations concerning the origins, nature, and importance of factional conflicts can be puzzling. A clear definition of what makes a faction, who belonged to factions, and what their aims were often appears impossible to state." And this is the best foil in the world because where scholars are uncertain about what made factionalism tick, and where some argue that factions were void of ideological content, where others argue that this can't be true, my preachers had no such qualms. They were not unsure. Instead, as we will see, the partisan was a highly activated ideological agent, hell-bent on the destruction of whatever community he found himself in. And so today we will explore three preachers who wrote long sermons on the topic of factionalism, specifically Bernardino of Siena, Giacomo of the Mark, and Leonardo of Udine. And this is a good moment to discuss the particular forms of the sources that I'm using. I study Latin sermons exclusively. Many scholars of preaching study vernacular works, and this is fantastic for those interested in performance and lay reactions to preaching due to, the reportatio, which sort of record this sort of thing. And vernacular works are exciting because as medievalists, it is very exciting to find sources that reached everyday people, right? And I know there are some notarial people in the audience, so you could talk about that. But since I am interested in political theory, I study Latin model sermons. And model sermons were written for other preachers to use. They operated as ready-made sermons for preachers to read and translate into the vernacular on the fly, or as preparatory sources for preachers as they crafted their own sermons sort of in their, laboratory, right, in their scriptorium or what have you. And in any case, it is my contention that the act of preserving a sermon in Latin as a model for other preachers shows that whatever topic the sermon was on was an issue that the author thought had a wide applicability to a variety of contexts and areas. The vernacular sermon was episodic and of the moment. It was a specific and targeted piece of media. The Latin sermon was concerning issues that the author thought would outlive him. And it is this sensibility that makes Latin sermons better, I think, for evaluating political sensibilities. But with all that said, we can now turn to Bernardino of Siena. He was one of the he was one of the most well-studied preachers of the 15th century and considered a saint by many in his own day. He was well acquainted with political conflict, strife, and the laity resisting peace. He lived through several bouts of plague, contracting it himself in 1400, leading to his dramatic conversion and joining the Franciscan observance. He saw the end of the Great Schism and wrote his sermons on factionalism after the exile and astounding return of Cosimo de' Medici at the head of thousands of men of the mountains to Florence. And Bernardino was one of the most successful preachers of the 15th century, leading a revolution in the composition of sermons, holding bonfires of the vanities, where he sort of encouraged Florentines and others to bring all their luxurious objects and to dramatically burn them to sort of punish themselves for their own vanity. And in so doing this, he beat Savonarola to the punch by quite a bit. Savonarola was a little more famous for this. And Bernardino preached entire Lenten cycles in both Siena and Florence. But in any case, from 1429 through 1440, we see him compose two full Lenten sermon cycles, or over 80 sermons. That is to say, two sermon cycles for Lent. And 5 of these are on the causes of partisanship. And you can see these sermons on the slide here. These 5 sermons work together. The first 2 that you'll see of the sermons deal with partisanship directly, diagnosing the circumstances which led people to become partisans and the emotional corruption that fueled them. The third dealt with how John of Patmos in the book of Revelation understood partisanship, elevating partisans for Bernardino into apocalyptic agents of the end of the world. The final 2 sermons deal with slanderers, and Bernardino clearly saw slander and slanderers as the primary agents for the spread of partisanship. As I will show, his sermons on slander also deploy apocalyptic themes. And it's sort of the apocalyptic themes that link all these together. Although there's also some more sermon studies methods that I can talk about later that lends to my belief that they were meant to be read together, but we don't need to get into the weeds with that. Now, Bernardino believed the partisan to be someone who was completely overcome by their emotions and thus unable to think rationally. In the first sermon on screen, he focused on all of the various ways that factionalism intensified other issues. Partisans made war worse, they inverted truth itself, they broke the promise of vows, and they were even, he argues, a few times worse than demons. And best of all, partisans were stupid. He returned to that over and over. He had a whole chapter on the stupidity of partisans. And all of this was fueled by the particular mental state of the partisan. And as he explains, quote, "The reason for this partisanship is that emotion is mutated on account of factionalism, and thus reason is blinded. For affect or emotion normally moves away from reason due to the fourfold emotional states, which are love and hate, hope and fear. From this, in Daniel 7:2, it is written, 'The 4 winds churn in the great sea. Doubtless it is the same in the judgment of the partisan mind.'" This unrestrained affect is what fueled partisan activity. And in fact, it spread like a disease, he argues over and over. He writes, quote, "In turn, having been corrupted by this partisan disease themselves, they infect other associates, helping their nature incline towards anger, and through reproach, obscuring the intelligence in both. Between people, offenses arise from some pretext, blood runs to the heart, and the fire of rage and fury are lit. This fire is kept lit as if dry kindling by so many sins." And it was this sort of emotional frenzy that led partisans to commit such heinous crimes, as he argues. And he has many descriptions of all the heinous crimes that they describe, so this is just one of many. And quote, "Here one is hanged, there one is killed, here one perishes in battle, while another ends their miserable life with an unhappy death. Fleeing men do not take their wives, but instead choose another life and country instead of what they had before. Unmarried women remain unmarried," the horror. "Or since they wander the world, they become prostitutes. Grown men starve like paupers, they melt away in sadness and much misery, and miserably wander here and there." But this partisan affective state could spread. Specifically, it is the slanderer who comes into focus here, for it is the slanderer who was the primary agent who spread the partisan mental state. Like the partisan, the slanderer was also unable to see reason, and since their vice was primarily moving others through speech, they were the perfect individual to spread partisanship. He writes, quote, "The slanderer inverts the good of another or converts it to evil by saying, for example, that evil had actually resulted from a certain good deed of that person," end quote. This process became, as he called it, pestilential, in that once a person was convinced by a slanderer, they would be infected with their shared affective disposition, bringing them into a common political community dedicated to factionalism. And Bernardino took the seven-headed dragon of Revelation 12 as a guide for understanding how slander spread like a poison. And this, of course, elevates it to being part of this apocalyptic system. He writes, quote, "At length, there are seven offenses and thus methods of offending and slandering, which slanderers use. And these may be called the seven poisonous heads of the dragon. The first method is secrecy, the second, denial, the third, deprivation, fourth, poisoning, fifth, public shame, sixth, magnifying, seventh, infamy or invention. The first four pertain to the destruction of good things, the remaining three augment evil things." And throughout the sermon, he goes through each one of these and details how precisely slanderers weaponize these things and then how that spreads to other people. And it was the apocalypse that linked slanderers and partisans together. Both sermons on slander take the great dragon of the apocalypse as a metaphor for understanding slanderers. Quote, "The dragon is said to be red as if blood-colored, that is, the slanderer is crazed and cruel," end quote. Just as the dragon brought death to both the elect and the wicked, so slanderers were like cannibals who brought ruin to their own kind. Quote, "The lion spares the wolf does not feast on another wolf, and all cruel beasts spare beasts of their own kind. Only the slanderer is busy devouring those of his own kind." Now, the metaphor of the dragon built on the final sermon we need to discuss in this series, where Bernardino wrote about partisans as agents of the apocalypse. Now, what Bernardino did here was quite complicated, and I definitely don't have time to unpack all of it. But a summary is that he focused on Revelation 8, 9, and 12. Bernardino saw partisans as bringing forth the punishments of Revelation 9, specifically from the horses who breathe fire and plagues onto humanity. And he makes clear links between the horses' mouths, the power of slander, and partisanship. Nice little triangle here. Revelation 8, meanwhile, serves to show us sort of where we are in the revelation. Specifically, we are in Revelation 8:13, when the angel flies over the earth and pities humanity because three more trumpets are about to sound that will rain down more death. Critically, though, Revelation 8:13 sees this angel indicating that a pause in the punishments is underway. But Bernardino indicates that partisanship is to blame for this whole situation and that this pause is necessarily not going to last. And so we can go back to the vignette we opened with, where Bernardino wrote, quote, "The evangelist said, and I beheld and heard the voice of one eagle flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, namely to that divisive and factional one. Woe on account of the sin of the heart, woe because of sinful speech, woe because of the sin of the wicked acts of partisanship." So the dragon, the angel, and the horses who bring plagues and death all combine into a powerful indictment of both slanderers and partisans. I could talk about this interplay a lot more. In particular, there's a whole angle that I would love to talk about whether or not Bernardino's talking about the Antichrist. And for those of you that know your Revelation, the dragon in Revelation 12 is very important, but we don't have time for that. So we can close with a typical sentiment from Bernardino on this issue, where he mixes a condemnation of partisanship with a foretelling of their just punishment, right? So you can see it on screen where he writes, from Matthew 12:32, the Lord said, partisanship, will not be forgiven, neither in this world nor in the world to come. Thus, the third part of man was killed, and fire and smoke and sulfur came from their mouths. And so ultimately, Bernardino's typological account of partisanship, with its sort of interlocking account of slanderers and the apocalypse and consenting to different deviant emotional states, I think stands in some juxtaposition to our next preacher, Giacomo della Marca. Giacomo, or James as he is often called in English language works, was a devout follower of Bernardinos. He entered the Franciscan order in 1416. He studied with John of Capistrano, who was also a follower of Bernardino, and he eventually served as a papal legate and inquisitor and engaged in successful preaching tours outside of Italy. Now, James wrote one sermon on the issue of partisanship, aptly named On Partisanship. It is unclear when he wrote it, but it comes as part of his Sermones Dominicales, or a model collection of sermons meant for Sunday preaching. This model collection is similarly undated, but it must be at least contemporaneous with Bernardino's because James copied liberally from Bernardino's first sermon on Guelphs and Ghibellines. This means that the earliest James could have written these was 1429, and this would only have been possible if Bernardino gave him early access to drafts. But it's very possible that this is exactly what happened because James followed Bernardino around really more or less until Bernardino's death in 1444, though he did go kind of do independent stuff during that period. But in any case, where Bernardino felt that partisanship was best understood as a deviant type of emotional comportment, James felt partisanship came from demonic possession. In fact, he specified 7 different demons who controlled partisans and their behaviors. The demons are as follows. 1, the exterminator of justice. 2, the destroyer of cities and all goods. 3, the operator of cruelty. 4, literally, the inseminator of pestilence. 5, the multiplier of crimes. 6, the inventor of discords and division. And 7, the inventor of desperation. In detailing the characteristics of these demons and how people acted when under their control, he focused almost exclusively on exterior actions. That is to say, the crimes that these people committed and sort of the characteristics of the demons, in contrast to Bernardino's focus on sort of interior states, right? And the sort of interior psychology of the partisan. Additionally, unlike Bernardino, Giacomo used Augustine's account of Roman civil strife as a way to support his points, creating an interesting depiction of medieval partisanship, which rested on Roman history as evidence of a kind of trans-historical phenomenon of partisans as demonically possessed, right? So Bernardino was quite focused on medieval Italy, where James is kind of seeing, the ancient Roman past has partisanship in almost the exact same way that sort of we have it now. And we can see this dynamic in play with Giacomo's first demon, the exterminator of justice. He wrote, quote, "I say that the diabolical partisan is the exterminator of all justice, because justice is the spirit of a republic. For just as the spirit of man sustains the body, and by leaving the body it dissolves and shrivels, so sacred justice sustains the republic in cities, and through it leaving, cities are destroyed, and rulership and kingdoms are not able to remain. So via partisanship, justice morphed into a twisted version of itself that sustained regimes of horror. Quote, because that party which rules favors all its own injustice and oppresses all others, end quote. He supported this point with an example from Augustine, writing on Sulla's dictatorship. Quote, Sulla, that Roman partisan citizen, upon entering Rome, gave power to his partisans to kill others without punishment and without justice. And his adversaries died in such a multitude that none were remaining, end quote. But Giacomo used Bernardino's own words to lend support to his ideas about factionalism. For instance, Giacomo used a long quote that is nearly identical to Bernardino's own words to introduce the second demon of partisanship. This is the destroyer of cities and all goods. Quote, and to make this clear, the quote I'm reading is originally Bernardino's, but it's Giacomo writing, right? Quote, buildings are destroyed, the goods of those people are plundered, vines are cut down, fields grow untended, arts and commerce are finished, livestock are devoured, the young are driven out with their parents, end quote. He continued, again following Bernardino almost word for word. Quote, for some are hung, others are cut down, some die, and others with a miserable life are furnished with a cruel death. Young women do not become mothers, they are not buried, they become vagrants, some prostitutes, others adulterers, end quote. And this is an excerpt. He continues, and he's just pulling from Bernardino for all of these kind of problems that emerge from factionalism. But Bernardino wrote these words originally in the context of describing how partisans destroy lands and countries more often than other types of people. But he does this because he says this was the result of enmity, right? He immediately prior to asserting all of these terrible things that happened, he described how partisanship was the result of enmity and hatred, using John Chrysostom to support his point. But he also quoted and glossed Romans 3:16 through 17, quote, "Destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes, namely, when they do not throw aside the divisions in their heart, along with other crimes, which instead they have refilled and do not relinquish," end quote. So for Bernardino, lands and countries are destroyed at a higher rate by partisans because, again, of their disordered emotional states, right? It's the divisions in their hearts that are the problem. And his list of crimes and strife was meant to illuminate the consequences of these disordered emotional states. For Giacomo, in contrast, partisans destroyed lands and countries because of this second demon, the destroyer of cities and all goods. That is to say, he used Bernardino's list of crimes and strife to show what the second demon did, not as a list of the consequences of disordered emotions. Moreover, after quoting Bernardino, he introduced an example from Augustine to drive the point home. Quote, "Augustine said that Marius, the Roman partisan, bloody from his own citizens, killed so many people from the other party, and the Roman Aulus killed illustrious men from the contrary party. And there were so many bodies of the dead that they filled the streets, the roads, and were strewn about in the theater. And it was difficult to tell who there was more of, the dead or of the living. And then they dragged them across the ground with their vitals exposed," end quote. So for Giacomo, we can see an account of partisanship that redeploys Bernardino's words to a different end. For him, partisanship was a product of demons and best understood as perhaps a sort of trans-historical issue. But Giacomo copied much more from Bernardino many more times in this sermon, and in sort of ways I don't have time to get into. He even adopted some of Bernardino's apocalyptic language, focusing briefly on slander in Apocalypse 9:12, writing that partisanship happened, quote, "on account of cruelty and the smoke of blind arrogance and the sulfur of fetid slander. And from these three plagues, a third part of men were killed." He even included something of a joke, satirizing his contemporaries' penchant for declaring long dead people as members of their party. Quote, "Towards the sixth principle," excuse me, technical, there we go. "Towards the sixth principle, I say that the sixth partisan devil is the instigator of division. Because just as Satan sent partisanship among the angels and among all unity, thus also with partisans. For they say that God is a Guelph, John the Evangelist is a Gibelline, John the Baptist too a Guelph, the lion is a Guelph, while the eagle is a Gibelline. But I was wishing to know one thing. What is the ass? From what party is he?" So with Giacomo, we see partisanship leave the world of interior mental states and move into the world of demonic possession and exterior acts. It suggests that he likely read Bernardino's complex and downright cosmological account of partisanship and felt that maybe it was too dense for practical use by other preachers. Unlike Bernardino, Giacomo also included stories from his time as a preacher, and he discussed moments where peacemaking efforts failed and violence resumed, sometimes in front of him as he called for peace. I think that for Giacomo, partisanship as demonic possession simplified things for his readers. And we should recall that he was an inquisitor too. And this would have made a lot of sense to him, I think. There were 7 demons one had to look out for. And this was significantly less complex than these kind of dense accounts of the revelation and sort of plumbing the depths of a person's psychology to figure out what emotional states they had consented to, right? And this, I think, would matter a lot, considering that both Giacomo and Bernardino would agree that partisans lied all the time. So interviewing them about whether or not they were consenting to this or that state, emotional condition might not get you very far. So maybe it's just possession, right? Now, Giacomo and Bernardino were engaged in a clear discursive and indeed literal relationship, as we have discussed. Our final preacher for today was much different, or Leonardo of Udine, or Leonardo Mattei, as he's sometimes known. Unlike our previous 2 preachers, Leonardo was a Dominican and a conventual, where the previous 2 were Franciscan observants. Now, Leonardo's innovation in our story was to formally integrate factionalism into the broader schema of discord. I don't have time to fully unpack what that means because it's quite complicated, but I can talk about it a little bit later if people are interested. But specifically, he collapsed many of the traditional distinctions that scholastics had made between discord and other vices. What this had allowed him to do was to take the centuries of thought on discord and apply them to the issue of political conflict. So a person could suffer from partisanship, according to Leonardo, in their social relationships, say, through envy, as much as a city could fall to partisanship because of its citizens scheming for offices and advantage. Moreover, Leonardo used an enormous array of classical citations to make his points, unlike Bernardino, who broadly used none, and Giacomo, who relied on Augustine to kind of mediate this for him. Now, Leonardo was born around 1400. His father was a town crier in Udine, giving him some proximity early in his life to governing affairs. By 1424, he was master of students in San Domenico and Bologna. And Stefan Vicenjovac argues that Leonardo received funds twice from the commune to support his studies in 1425 and 1427. He attended the Council of Florence and was asked to write treatises refuting some of the conclusions reached at the Council of Basel in 1431. He preached a Lenten cycle in Florence in 1434, in Venice, and then in Venice in 1436. He preached for the Pope and the Curia in 1439, and thereafter he settled in the Friuli region, but he was very active and preached a lot and authored many treatises. Interestingly, he was also asked by the commune of Udine to write a treatise refuting some of Giacomo della Marca's ideas about some points due to communion and like the Immaculate Conception. So he's very much part of this world, right? Now, Vicenjovac has studied many of Leonardo's vernacular sermons, including some that were preached. He shows that Leonardo was keenly sensitive to the delicate balance of power at play in Udine, which had recently come under Venetian dominion. He counseled the rulers of Udine to aim towards unity, peace, and concord. Vicenjovac really unpacks what Leonardo's ideas about governance were, which were broadly quite Thomist. And Leonardo's, all of this preaching he does, all of this was in an effort to limit conflicts among the urban patriciate and the Castellan nobility. And as Vicenjovac writes, quote, a situation that was exacerbated by the inefficiency of the justice system, which contributed to vendetta becoming the main means by which to resolve conflict, end quote. So with all this, and with Vicenjovac's really interesting work on Leonardo and governance, it seems important to know what Leonardo thought about factionalism, right? Now, thankfully for us, Leonardo wrote a sermon on factionalism in a Lenten sermon cycle written around 1458. This is an awesome sermon, and it's around 13,000 words in total. So to say that we won't be covering it in depth today is a bit of an understatement, but he organized the sermon and all the sermons in this cycle by law, specifically 8 divisions of law: natural law, divine law, prophetic law, human law, evangelical law, apostolic law, canon law, and ecclesiastical law. And then in the sermon on discord and factionalism, following these 8 divisions, he listed the 40 causes of factionalism, just in case you hadn't gotten the point. And these 8 legal categories, of course, have a dizzying array of divisiones, distinctiones, conclusiones, and the like. And it was quite the doozy to get through, I got to tell you. At one point, there was a portion in the sermon where Leonardo promises to give 8 conclusions about a given topic. And in conclusion 1, he makes 27 distinctions before you get to conclusion 2. So we're going to summarize. In a word, then, Leonardo understood factionalism to be the political instantiation of discord. If discord came from a disunion of wills, then factionalism was the disunion of wills played out at the corporate and political level. Thus, it was not unique to republics. It was not unique to sort of a democratic society. It affected all regime types and all peoples. Now, of course, the inverse of this, he spends much time on. The inverse is, of course, peace, charity, and love. And so Christianity was the basis of how he's thinking about rulership. Citing Genesis 40, he wrote, quote, I saw before me a vine on which there were 3 branches. To the Holy Spirit is attributed mercy. It has the flask of wine, that is, comfort and grace. These 3 things, namely mercy, comfort, and grace, are one because there is one God. Thus we ought to be one. And what he's sort of doing here is he goes through in the first section, he's trying to explain that just because there is a multiplicity does not mean we all can't be one, right? Just because we have different offices and different classes of people, we can all live in unity together. He added to this notion using Ovid and the poets, who wrote of the Gorgon sisters, of whom Medusa is the most famous. In Leonardo's telling, some of these Gorgons shared only one eye between them, exchanging it based on need, which is kind of sweet. He extends this metaphor quite literally to humans, writing, quote, "Thus, however much more we have with the body, we ought to have one little eye of the heart, which we share in turn." Or another example, he cited Galatians 4, "You are all one in charity, for it is just like cement that makes from many stones one indestructible wall. Thus love binds and brings together many hearts and forms from many peoples one piety and a noble home." Now, Leonardo marched through each legal schema and demonstrated that concord was the basis of all law and factionalism its opposite. So as divine law through the Trinity showed that a multiplicity could still create unity, so even pagans knew that factionalism was bad because of natural and human law, because they had that. So Christians should know even better with the aid of divine ecclesiastical canon and apostolic law. In these 8 legal conceptions, if we just count his classical sources, he cited Terence, Prudentius, Fulgentius, Cicero, Varro, Plato, Valerius Maximus, Pseudo-Seneca, Livy, Julius Celsus, Sallust, kind of through Augustine, but he just says it's Sallust, Ovid, and Lucan. And this is just his classical sources. And so there is a lot of work that I've been doing on all of the kind of fancy interplay that he's doing with these sermons, because with these sources, because he was quite crafty with them. In the section on human law, he invented 4 positive, non-partisan virtues people should have. And I know that's a mouthful. If you have ideas on how I should frame that better, let me know. But what he's doing here is the whole sermon is about factionalism is terrible. And then in the middle of the sermon, he says, here are 4 values you can have to not be a partisan, right? So that's as close as I got. He invented 4 positive, non-partisan virtues people should have. These were majesty, advantage, duty and immortality, and love. Now, these are things you're supposed to feel towards your country. And if you feel them, you won't be a partisan, right? And interestingly, he exclusively used classical sources to detail what each of these were. Moreover, he edited the language of his sources to bend them towards his ends. Overall, Leonardo went further than both Giacomo and Bernardino in creating actionable categories for people to sort of be non-partisan, and he also weaponized classical sources to support his points. Now I'm going to demonstrate this through one example with Valerius. To explain majesty, which is our first category, Leonardo quoted from Book 5 of Valerius's 9 books of memorable deeds and sayings. However, he's going to deviate in one way from Valerius's actual quote. I'm going to read you Valerius's entire original, and on screen is the shorter Latin version that Leonardo actually quotes. But this is Valerius's sort of original contextual quote. Quote, "Piety has done justice to the closest ties of blood. It remains that piety towards country be set in view. To the majesty of country, even the authority of parents, which is equated with the divinities of the gods, subjects its power. And brotherly affection too yields readily and gladly, with the best of reason, because when a household is overturned, the state of the commonwealth may remain intact, but the downfall of a city necessarily drags the household gods of all its inhabitants down with it." But Leonardo changed the beginning. Valerius begins with pietas, right? Piety has done justice to the closest ties of blood. It remains that piety towards the country be set in view. But Leonardo excised the first sentence of this quote and switched piety for societas. So by my reading, Leonardo's first sentence begins not by saying, quote, "It remains that piety towards the country be set in view," but instead, "Let fellowship to the country now be shown, and to its majesty even the authority of parents yields," end quote. Now, the switching for of pietas for societas is curious. Certainly, a preacher might have agreed that one should have piety to the homeland, but perhaps the word was too loaded with divine connotations. But in any case, given that this sermon is about political fracturing, societas, what he kind of inserts here, operates as a double entendre that highlights the need for connection in its abstract meaning of fellowship, but also to underscore the need for holding actual respect, or majesty, for the literal societas one lived in, namely one's government and community. Now, those of you who deal with medieval sources are probably itching to interject to remind us that medieval preachers were only worried about getting the gist of a source rather than quoting it verbatim. And I hear you, I'm working through it. It is well known that medieval literati were less concerned about plagiarism and misattribution. However, Leonardo does this so consistently, and it seems intentional. For instance, still talking about the value of majesty, Leonardo discusses the famous story of Mucius Scaevola, who heroically attempts to assassinate Lars Porsena to save Rome. Leonardo tells us he is getting this story from Augustine, complete with book and chapter information, but Leonardo's account is 3 times longer, and he dramatizes the moment where Scaevola casts his hand into the flame to sort of play up his patriotism, right? In the other stories he brought up, namely the stories of Themistocles, Publius Decius Mus, and Marcus Curtius, Leonardo brought forth his editorial hand again and again to make his sources speak more directly to the issues of factionalism and to the 4 non-partisan virtues. In one case with Livy, he explained the function of each pagan god invoked by Decius so that he could then explain that nowadays, these pagan gods, which he kind of glosses, as you can see on screen, that he wants to say, this is what Decius is doing. These are the types of gods he's talking about, but these gods are demons now, right? So as Decius sort of devoted himself to the gods in his ancient context, a modern medieval Christian should be similarly devoted to one's country, but not actually perform the ancient Roman devotio, which was to make a pact with hell, right, in our modern medieval day. But in any case, Leonardo's focus on law in the classical past continued into his 40 causes of discord, in which these causes are as myriad as Leonardo's sources. The 40 causes show that partisanship for Leonardo was everywhere. Cause 20, for instance, was deformed morals, as people with deformed morals could not work towards the common good. Whereas cause 18 was fighting truth, as such people embraced falsehood, which endangered the community. More practical and maybe more familiar to his readers was cause 16, dispensing gifts and benefices. This went with causes 14 and 15, which were grave inequality and literally holding office. And he writes, quote, for an appetite for offices and dignities more often is the cause of ruin and discord in a republic, end quote. He then fittingly used Augustine to discuss Marius, that ancient Roman partisan who we've already discussed, and his appetite for office. And as you have come to expect, he did not get the Augustine quote exactly right, and he does some clever things that we don't have time to get into. But we should finish up, you know? I think I can now talk about some takeaways from my research and where I think it is headed next. With Bernardino, Giacomo, and Leonardo, we can see a sophisticated discourse on factionalism emerging in the 15th century. I argue that we should treat these sermons as treatises on political theory, since they all attempt to systematize what factionalism was, what caused it, and why. That they came up with different answers just proves my point in my mind, right? This is a more sophisticated discourse when we're disagreeing, I suppose. For Bernardino, partisans were experiencing a form of emotional corruption that was contagious, that spread through slander and was linked to the apocalypse and thus predicted in the book of Revelation. Giacomo, working with Bernardino's sermon, saw it primarily not as an emotional disorder, but as possession. As an inquisitor himself, perhaps he felt partisans could be more easily spotted by looking for signs of possession and not plumbing the depths of a person's emotional state. Leonardo, by contrast, working independently of the two and a member of a different order, saw partisanship as the activated political form of discord. It was the rending of wills made manifest in political life, and it was best understood as deviance from all forms of licit law. Now, these sermons indicate to me that factionalism was understood by contemporaries as a political concept. The partisan was not just a person to these men who served a party. He was a person who had ideas and values attached to that faction. And these ideas were not simply sort of contextual. They were not the sort of rational actor strategy that we sometimes get in scholarship. So this is not simply that Medicians were pro-Medici, but that the identity of the partisan was a real one to inhabit. It was not simply a rhetorical pejorative to throw at someone, or at least my preachers thought partisans were a clear political identity, and that partisans went beyond simple self-interest, right? That there's something more happening here. And I think we can also, this is very speculative, right? But I think if I think of the long-term impact of factionalism as category, we can sort of revisit some of the big questions of the field, like, was civic humanism real? Did medieval people care about regime types? Were medieval people really Republicans in the way that Barron wants us to see them? Or do we need to kind of adopt James Hankins' more recent work on virtue politics? And there's all sorts of different angles that we've sort of explored over the last 7 decades on this question, right? And so what I wonder in studying factionalism is perhaps we have been looking for positive beliefs too much in our effort to map medieval political belief. We have been looking for how did they understand the good political community, and assuming they would have accepted that question as paramount. And there are ample studies, for instance, on the common good, on peace, on the rightly ordered state, and the like. But not to invoke the specter of Huizinga too much, but in a world that feared decay more than death, in a world where demons were very real, in a world of famine, plague, and occasionally running street battles, right, with the Guelphs, perhaps the question should not be what was the ideal political community, but what did the bad political community look like, right? What if we assume this was the basis of political inquiry in medieval Italy? And that's sort of what I kind of see reflected in this discourse on factionalism, right? But as I said, I'm speculating and I can't prove any of that yet, but that's where we're kind of headed. That's what I would like to do. And finally, for the purposes of this study, here is what actually remains for me to do in very brief, because there's actually a lot more. But I have two more preachers to deal with, Roberto Caracciolo and Michael de Carcano, both who wrote sermons on discord and partisanship. And so I need to read them. So that's in the immediate future. More broadly, I would like to push the boundaries of what we consider the linguistic breadth of factionalism. For time's sake, I will simply put it this way. When a 15th century Italian was listening to a sermon on envy or a sermon on arrogance, would he have thought of factionalism? Right? The laity were used to preachers. They often knew the rules of the game and what was being connected to what, just as many of us do when listening to a genre we are used to. What does factionalism as category become if lay people thought of partisans, perhaps even partisans they knew, when they heard a sermon on peace, envy, jealousy, hatred, murder, love, charity, ambition, or arrogance? And thank you so much for coming. That's where I'll end it for now. And I went a little over time, so I apologize. Try to stop sharing here. And I'm happy to answer any questions.